Okay.
Thank you so much for doing this. I was ecstatic that you responded to my email. So I was very very excited about it. Thank you so much for doing this. This you are, by the way, you are
Uh,
the first interview or whatever you want to call conversation partner I think I've ever had who sent me homework. I loved it. I loved the nothing essay, which I thought was great. I'd love to talk about that. I loved the universe essay as well. I thought that was fantastic, especially the. I love the way that you treat these questions with a scientific uh, process, because I think that a lot of people don't do that. So I really appreciate
I
that. And
think,
then,
I think that's good. I think it's a way to think. It doesn't mean science knows everything, but science is a way. It's a process of thinking. I call it a way of thinking, and that doesn't necessarily mean that all truth can be known by science. But science teaches you a way to think that you can evaluate issues, and if you want to jump beyond science, that's fine. Faith or whatever you want to call it, or belief, or interview, know what you're doing when you're doing it. Because most people confuse the two, that it's all sort of lumped together.
right, right. We're kind of already starting into this stuff. I should introduce you. Robert Lawrence Kuhn is our guest, and you are in a lot of different spheres. I think you're in more spheres than I originally thought, because my exposure to you has been through Closer to Truth on YouTube. I think that's somewhat a byproduct of my age, though, because you've been doing Closer to Truth for over 2 decades now on
Yep.
PBS public television.
Yep.
In fact, in one of the essays that you sent me about the universe, you told an anecdote about kind of what started you down this path when you were 12 years old, about questioning the idea of there not being anything, and why is there something if it's so much easier based on the laws of the universe and whatnot, that for there to be nothing.
Right. That was a very profound moment of life. I was 12 years old at summer camp, and uh, for I'd say 3 decades, I would remember that something scared me so much that I had to put it out of my mind, and I couldn't remember what it was. And after then, about 3 decades, the sense that, what if there were nothing at all? That means not just no physical things, but literally nothing. No God, no spiritual world, no physical world, no laws, um, no abstract objects, although I wouldn't have known what those were at the time. Um, and that was such a frightening thought that I desperately tried to put it out of my mind. And I successfully did. And for years, I would try to rethink what was it that so scared me. And then, for whatever reason, when I was in my, I don't know, middle 40s or something, I remember what it was. And that's been a great motivator. That the energy behind thinking about the nature of reality and phrasing it from that famous comment, "Why is there something rather than nothing?" And many people think about that question, or have that question arise to them. And almost all the time when people think about that question, they think they're the first person to ever wonder about
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
and then and then after a while, we all find that many people have thought about it before, and it's traditionally, at least, expressed in that form, traced back to Leibniz in the 17th century. So to me, but a lot of people go through that, and that's very interesting. I've also thought that when I've done Closer to Truth, the most fascinating thing about it to me is that from a resume on paper or people's CV, or you cannot predict whether they will like the topics we deal with or not. There's no educational background, geography, ethnicity, race, religion, gender, socioeconomic level. Absolutely none. It's just people have this inner sense of a desire to understand what these big questions are. My favorite, we've gotten obviously tens of thousands of feedbacks over the years, but I think my favorite was from a woman in Bakersfield. And she said, I'm happily married. I have 5 adult sons. They're truck drivers and mechanics. And I've thought about these questions my whole life, but my husband and my 5 sons think I'm insane, that I'm crazy for thinking about these things. And then what happened is my oldest son had a son, so my grandson, who's now 13 years old, and he loves these questions. So he and I together watch Closer to Truth.
That's got to be pretty amazing as an experience for you to be able to do that.
I mean, that's been very gratifying. And the way I describe it is, there's a small subset of humanity that's fascinated by these topics or perhaps obsessed by them. And you can't see from the outside who they are. I have three children, two sons. Some people say they look like me, and one is an MBA CPA. The other is a film editor who graduated philosophy of science, history of science at Harvard. And they appreciate what I do, but they're not really excited about it. But my daughter, who was not trained in science, she's loves it. And so you couldn't tell by if you had a complete resume of these kids of who would like it and who would not. So that's sort of the enjoyment to me, to see who reacts to it and why. That's been a good corollary benefit. That's not why I did it in the first place or why I do it, but it's very nice to see. And now with YouTube, of course, we get it from all over the world. I mean, we have Peru and Suriname and Iran and India. And it's really worldwide. And you see the different names, so you know that they're different ethnicities. But they all have the same kind of inner desire. So it's a good unifier for humanity. We need that at this time.
The variety of people that you talk to on Closer to Truth, as you mentioned, is vast. I mean, you talk to religious leaders, you talk to people who are academics, you talk to people who are, I would say, thought leaders, scientists, physicists especially. I think quantum physicists. I talked to Sean Carroll earlier this week, and he's interviewed David Chalmers, and he's got his own ideas about dualism and physical. He's a physicalist. Chalmers is a dualist, and although I'm sure he gets a lot of crap about that from his cohorts in the scientific community, I feel like
not quite a dualist.
Is it a property dualist? Maybe I'm shortchanging him there. Is that what it's called?
That is a whole category. But that Chalmers is not that. He's not going.
Uh-oh. We may be having an unstable connection here.
Non-reducible to anything else. So primitive, as they say. And whether he wouldn't go so far as to say that consciousness is the only thing, which other people would, and everything is derivative from consciousness. But he would give consciousness a primitive primacy in the levels of reality, that it would be at the lowest level. Maybe there's other stuff at that level too, like laws of physics or whatever. And of course, Sean Carroll, both of whom are good friends in multiple occasions on Closer to Truth, we pretty much violently disagree with that.
Yeah, right. And I think that's where, do you feel like the scientific community gets, I feel like they're kind of like picky eaters a little bit, they don't like their peas and carrots touching very much.
Well, I think it's unfair to characterize the whole scientific community with, one in one basket, because that's not the
Absolutely.
case. And the divisions or categories of human knowledge or things that we know is broad. And science, the way I look at it, is a way of thinking. And it is also a process for discerning kinds of truths. And so the scientific method is well known through experimentation and induction of hypotheses and testing hypotheses, and looking for, as Popper said, falsification of hypotheses. That's not the only way that science is done, but it's a useful tool. And the nature of proof in science and progress can be made. But there are, question is, are there truths that science cannot discern through that process of experimentation or observation, as it may be in astrophysics? And what about those areas of truth? And so what I like to say is that I look upon everything from a scientific way of thinking as opposed to the scientific method per se. Scientific method per se is pretty isolated, defined well in particle physics, for example, because you can really discern things very, very efficiently and very effectively. I have my window open, and we're at the beach. So if you want to see.
Wow, that's very nice. You got a better view than I do, and I live in Colorado.
I can close the window if the ambient noise is too loud.
No, you're fine.
Okay. So I like to say the scientific way of thinking is a way of thinking that doesn't necessarily demand scientific observation and falsification and experimental replicability, use of statistics and all of that. But it does demand a rigorous logical way of thinking. And so some people they sound like the same thing, but to me they're not, because there are areas of knowledge potentially, whether it's in philosophy or anomalous phenomena like ESP, which we could talk about if you want. I'm not I'm fairly agnostic on it, but I'm passionate and agnostic about a lot of different topics. But it's a way of thinking that if one wants to say that the only way you can understand consciousness is through inner experience and meditation and elimination of the self, as some Buddhists would say, or kind of an abrogation to where you have the view from nowhere, or a complete emptiness, not a nothing in the philosophical sense, but kind of an emptiness of reality. If you want to say that to me, anything is a legitimate area for exploration. But what I would force people to do is to clearly say what their steps in their logical way of thinking is. And if you want to make a jump where you can't define that through a logical process of thinking, but it's because I just know it because I've experienced it, and if you haven't, I can't, that's okay with me. But I want you to know that you are making that logical jump based upon whatever you think you're based upon, your own inner experience. And that's fine. If I've not had that, okay, so then I'm not able to make that jump with you. And at least you're not using a false way of demonstration to try to convince me that's you're right. I approach this in so-called proofs of God. People can believe in God, but many times they will use what I think are fallacious kinds of demonstrations or proofs. And once again, they're free to make the belief, but I want them to have this very logical approach. You made one comment earlier, which is not quite true. I mean, Closer to Truth talks to many distinguished people. You mentioned two, Sean Carroll and David Chalmers. That's, two of our core regulars. But the group of people is a fairly small subset of even the engaged community, because the approach we have in general is a philosophical one, and it's scientific and philosophical, and it's analytical in the sense of this rational way of thinking. But even though we're applying that rational way of thinking to all different kinds of topics, even if those topics are not rational. but we do not do religious leaders or gurus or people who kind of are masters of psychology or things, because that's a different world. That's not our world. I'm not saying that world is not real, or it's just that I can't use the same kind of analytical thinking with that world as I could with other worlds. So when we deal with aspects of religion, for example, it's philosophy of religion as opposed to the experience and the personal feelings. People can say that, but that we don't seek to affirm or deny it.
How would you categorize that? Would you call that mysticism? I don't know if that's the right word.
Mysticism would be a subset of that category. I think people who make those claims are not all mystics, although mysticism is, it depends how you define it. It can have a very narrow definition or a broader, however you want. But people who believe I'd say a key technique is any kind of meditative activity. If people are involved in that, that's one kind of category of thinking. There are many people in religious world who, both in Judeo-Christian traditions, Islamic traditions, who are not necessarily mystical in that same sense, although they have beliefs in lots of stuff beyond the physical.
Sure. So I guess it's really more of like an extrapolation beyond what is reasonable, I guess, or what can be reasonably questioned or something like that.
I'd say it is a leap or a jump from what is. I think the best way to put it is in terms of third person demonstrability. So if I've had a personal experience, I can explain it to you, but I can't demonstrate it to you.
Right.
On the other hand, if I'm talking about, pick one of 1,000 subjects, the fine tuning of the universe, that the laws of physics seem to be fine tuned to enable life, and this is a full year of discussion if we want to explore it in depth. We do a lot of that on Close to the Truth. We probably run over the years, 15 television shows on this topic from all different angles. Including recently our Series 19, which is on YouTube. We had 7 shows on fine-tuning, philosophy of physics and philosophy of cosmology. So if I deal with that, we can discuss that in a third-person sense. So I can present the arguments to you. If I wanted to show the other side of the argument, why fine-tuning is not as much as good as people think it's cracked up to be, I can make those arguments.
Yeah.
And so if a third person was listening to us, they would follow our arguments. Maybe they'd agree with me, maybe they'd agree with you, but they'd have all the pieces to deal with. Those are the kinds of topics we deal with. If somebody says, well, I just know God, or I just know I'm in touch with this, cosmic consciousness, I'm not going to refute that. I'll press on it a little bit, but that's not a third person demonstrable kind of claim. Again, by my not dealing with it extensively doesn't mean that it's not true or doesn't exist. It means that that's not an area that I feel compelled to explore in great depth. Though we do some of it because some of that is a legitimate critique of what we do, of our core, which is a rational approach to questions about cosmos, consciousness, and the search for meaning, or philosophy of religion, if you will. And so critiques of that, mostly from Eastern kinds of traditions, but also from aspects of Judeo-Christian world, would critique that you can't ever approach real truth by what we do. So it's kind of a complete. Most people say, it's good, it's interesting, I follow it, it's fun, but you'll never, ever approach reality and know depth by doing what you do, meaning me, and close to the truth. And that's a legitimate critique. It's an absolutely legitimate critique, and I will engage with people like that. Normally, if we have 5 contributors to a particular show on maybe analytic discussions of the existence of God, you might have one of the 5 who'll make the point, say, you can argue it back and forth, but it's impossible because of the nature of reality that you will come. So that's a legitimate point, but I'm not going to spend a lot of effort to delve into that, but use it as a critique of what we do. Because what we do, I feel comfortable that we're presenting the best thinking in the contemporary world. It may be a little arrogant on my part to think that, but in our constrained area, basically, the philosophy of science, physics, cosmology, philosophy of mind, philosophy of religion, we're really bringing who we believe are the best thinkers in the world. We have a skew towards Western thinking. That's true. It's because of where I am physically. Most of our work is in the US and UK. But we try to reach out to broader traditions, Islamic, Buddhist, Hindu, although we're weak in the latter two. More Islamic we have, but need to develop in the other areas. And so within our category, we really want to present the best thinking. When we first started, we were thinking of taglines, and if I had one saying, if you were an alien and you wanted to see how far humanity has come on the big questions, you would watch Closer to Truth. Kind of an arrogant, kind of a jokey way to present what we were saying. So an alien, and you had to choose what to do to figure out what these guys, these human beings think about. You should watch Closer to Truth.
I don't think it's inaccurate, though. I think it's a very good cataloging of these questions and all of the variations of ideas, reasonable ideas or reasonable approaches to the ideas that are out there. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, which is kind of adjacent to what we're talking about, is the anthropic principle. You had written a little section about the anthropic principle in there. I think it is really core to a lot of people's frustrations, is that, in order to observe something, you have to have space to allow for observation to be possible. And so that's really kind of where I think people are a little bit confused about kind of how consciousness works in relation to the very rigid structures, the physical laws of the universe that seem very, very much there, and then squaring that with their subjective conscious reality is very difficult, I think. Maybe impossible. I don't know, but it just seems like those two things seem to really, the absence of an observer. If you take the observer out of the equation entirely, what is there? What is there? So I think that's where a lot of people, especially when they're asking these questions, kind of get lost a little bit in the weeds.
Yeah, I think there are, just to sect apart two things you said. One is the anthropic principle, which is very fun and very probative to understand. In fact, one of our recent shows was exactly on that. In our 19th season, you can scan. We have 13 episodes in every season, and chosen from cosmos, consciousness, and meaning, or philosophy of religion. And it's one of those in the series 19 is on the anthropic principle. But to really, and we have one of the founders of it, and I mean, so we really describe it in depth. So the anthropic principle is, there's a weak one and a strong one. The weak one is almost a tautology. It says that for an observer to exist, the conditions have to be such that the observer can exist. And that's actually more. There's more in it than it sounds. Sounds like it's a tautology, means nothing, but it's the argument for why are we on this earth with everything so perfect? Well, we can't be in the middle of the sun because it's too hot. we can't exist there. So you have to exist where you can exist. And so there's a self-selection effect. Many people have miswritten. In fact, the founder of the anthropic principle, Brendan Carter, has lamented that he named it anthropic because there's more, that people bring more into that than was originally intended. So the other question, though, is a very fundamental one, which is the clash between the observer aspect of consciousness and the physical aspects of the universe. And this has gotten more complicated with quantum mechanics seeming to require an observation as part of the quantum mechanic process.
Right.
And I'd say this is an area of extreme differences of opinion and high volatility, even among the hard-nosed physicists about what it means. So you have radically different interpretations. What is an observation? Do you need a consciousness for an observation? Well, consciousness has been around for a few 100 million years, even if it's you bring it pretty low on the phylogenetic scale. What happened before that? Because there were 13.8 billion, at least in our universe, years in the past, and then some people say, well, you can have retro causation where consciousness now chooses from a history of quantum histories, and consciousness now can self-select out of the past. And these are not as crazy as they may sound, but they are still crazy. The multi-world theory, where this vast quantum branching at every moment, and other people say, that's all hocus pocus, and observation is just sort of a technical term, and anything can observe anything else. So a thermometer is an observer, or even just the colliding of molecules, in a sense, are observing each other by their collision. And so the quantum world can work like that. But at the end of the day, the question of consciousness, the inner sense of self-awareness, the movie we all see, even if you're blind, you have this sense of things, is a real question that is, I think, one of the great probative questions of what the nature of reality is. And it's most interesting thing is that there are very smart, very committed people at every node on the spectrum. And so from the one extreme where consciousness is consciousness is not even real. I mean, it just doesn't exist. You can eliminate it, eliminative physicalism or materialism, where consciousness is kind of a self-induced delusion that maybe had some evolutionary benefit that emerged from just a purely physical, wetware of our brains. And all the way to the other extreme, where consciousness is the only reality, everything else is either a dream or in a mystical sense, or is a derivative from the manifestation of consciousness. It's the other extreme. And then there are lots of stuff in the middle. Like we talked about Dave Chalmers, he might have consciousness being irreducible and fundamental, along with some other things in the physical world. So that's just part of the properties of the physical world. Just like gravity is a fundamental property, so is consciousness in some way. So you really have a very broad, and that to me is a fascinating thing. I love to do that. I love to categorize and organize the thinking and the different categories of thinking in each of these critically big topics.
What do you think our best chances to link consciousness to something that we can measure? Something that we can.
Well, ask a question that way. We can do that now. I mean, you can measure states of consciousness, altered states of consciousness. And that's if you're an anesthesiologist, that's your job. That's your day job. It's consciousness. Thus is our night job, and we're having fun talking about it. An anesthesiologist, that's their day job. And so, they measure it all the time. And so, then altered states through drugs or other kinds of meditation and, process that creates altered states. And then there's one of the theories of consciousness, which Giulio Tononi has promulgated, backed by Christoph Koch, very smart and sophisticated people of integrated information theory, where he says, phi, which is a measure of consciousness, can be measured. And then he has theories of what therefore consciousness is in some sense. I believe that I would segregate what he says into two parts. One is the measurement of consciousness, which is, I think, can be a scientific question. Again, an anesthesiologist has to do with that. And the nature of what consciousness, is in some ultimate sense. Because at the end of the day, most theories about consciousness come to some kind of an identity theory, which is whatever you want to say it is, that is the consciousness, whether it's the firing of neurons or the transmission of chemicals or brain waves floating over the whole cerebral cortex or global workspace. Or, these are all, at some point you have to say something is the conscious, that is the feeling that we all have. And that's where kind of everything breaks down. Nobody can seem to bridge that explanatory gap. But to measure consciousness, how much there is there and how much is not, that's a good scientific question. And I think good progress is being made. And it has some, significant therapeutic benefits in terms of locked-in syndrome, where people are in a coma, they can't communicate, can't move anything sometimes, maybe an eyelid, but maybe nothing at all. Maybe nothing at all, and they look like they're in a coma and maybe should pull the plug, but they can communicate. And they've shown that that if you tell a person who has no externalities whatsoever to think about playing tennis or think about driving a car, or some two different things, you can see differences in their brainwaves when they do one thing or another, and then they can control that in some way. And so that's a signal that there's some, even though there's no externalities, that there's something going on inside. So that's both exciting and frightening on a clinical level. And so measuring consciousness and determining what consciousness is are two radically different aspects of this big question.
Yeah, sure. And I think, I'm glad you said there's something going on inside. You can measure something.
Yes.
I want to know what that something is, I guess. I think that's, where we're trying to get.
You can measure what that something is. The question is, what is that? Does that exhaust, and does that say that's what consciousness is? So you can measure the electroencephalogram, the electrical activity from the skull, or if you need to do neurosurgery for epilepsy, you can put the electrodes on the brain itself, and you can see those brainwaves. You know what their the hertz are, the number of frequencies per second. You know the structure of it. You know what it's related to, and you know that you never have the conscious experience of playing tennis unless you see those things, those spikes, or those in certain regions of the brain, or certain characteristics. And so you can measure that, and it's a direct correlation, but that's still, arguably doesn't even begin to answer the fundamental question. How do you go from that to the experience, inner experience that we have?
Right, which could be, and I think you may, or somebody you quoted made the distinction between that being a reproductive experience, something that's reproduced as not a simulation, like there's real stuff, but that is recreated basically as an experience in your brain, and that's what you see. Is that
Well, you said there's real. There is real physical correlates of what of everything we experience, whether it's something we hear, or language, or vision, or anything, or thought, or anything. There are physical correlates of all of that.
Right.
We know a great deal, learning more, and ultimately we'll learn more and more. But the general feeling is that even if we know everything, we're still not going to make that ultimate leap into really now knowing this inner, how you have the inner picture that you do, and that feeling, the so-called quality.
And, that's I guess that's the question is, are we going to be in the future of humanity permanently kind of encapsulated in our physical bodies that we're born in? Or can we somehow figure out a way to get consciousness either gradually or maybe eventually permanently into some sort of artificial creation, maybe some like, a computer of some kind?
Sure. And this is a big question. I wrote a big piece on this called Virtual Immortality. It's on the Closer to Truth website and other places on the web. And I asked that question, because it's what I call the techno-optimists in Silicon Valley. It's an engineering problem. It's not a conceptual problem. To me, it's a conceptual problem. It's not an engineering problem, because whether it'll take, some people say 20 years, 20 million years of technology improvement, 20 years to 20 million years, that to me is irrelevant. The question is it possible in principle? And the key test of this is that if you can take your individual personal consciousness and upload it or put it into another medium so you could live longer and have different kinds of fun or whatever, journey to the stars and spaceships, in a computer, and that's you. If you can do that, then once, because you have this total electronic, you could do it twice. If you do it twice, you can do it a million times. So if you do that, if we take your brain and we know every single thing, we know every polarization of every particle in your brain and can reproduce that, and then let it run, and maybe that's 10 to the 20th or 10 to the 30th bits of information, maybe 10 to the 100th, I don't know, but it's a number like that. It can't be more. You can figure out the number of particles in your brain and do all the permutations and combination to come up with a number. At some point, that could possibly be computable or uploadable. But if you do that, and you do it, just to be real simple, 5 times. So what are the possibilities in terms of your first person consciousness? With the fun question saying, at the end of the day, would you be willing to take destroy the original, because you now have the duplicate in a non-physical, non-flesh mechanism, physical mechanism, but non-flesh. And so you can last forever. So what are the possibilities if you now do it 5 times? Well, you can say, here's you, and here's the 5 ones we've uploaded. Okay.
Yeah.
So so I like to do, what's the universe of possibilities? Well, one possibility is that you're you, and those 5 are like, each one is like a twin brother. I mean, your twin brother, if you have a twin brother, if it's an identical, then have exactly the same DNA. Maybe a mutation here or there, but arguments say even if it's the same DNA, but you have no consciousness that's shared in any way. So that's one possibility, is that you're still you. Now you have 5 twin brothers, more twin than physical DNA, because it's matched you in it, and then the next microsecond, nanosecond, each one develops on its own, because it starts as you, and each one thinks it's you. Each one could fool your psychiatrist and your wife and your children that it's you. There's no way that it's not you, but in terms of your innocence, it's not you, and you have 5, super twins. That's one possibility. Second possibility is that you're now fractionated, and so you are in, a part of you is in each of those, and so each one, and the only way you get your whole one is to combine them together in some way. Third possibility is that you are identical. All of them is exactly you, and they all sort of feed back, and you have this kind of split personality all at the same time, whether one dominates or you can handle them all simultaneously, who knows. Science fiction writer and Closer to Truth contributor David Brin has a novel where you can duplicate yourself, and each one goes out and does things in the day and then comes back and combines themselves. So that's another possibility. The and then you have to match that against what happens to the original if you do anything. Well, the first case, the original stays the same and it's just twins. But if you fractionate into the 5, or you're duplicated in each of the 5, what happens to the original? Are you still there or not? And if you're there, that makes it even more complicated. So what seems to come out of this is that the assumption that when you know everything about the brain, you'll be able to upload your own literal first-person consciousness is questionable. And I think it's an open question. I would right now lean to more doubt than belief in principle. I mean, take 20 million years, 100 million years, still in principle, not clear that you can ever be able to do that, because there's something about consciousness, personal consciousness, that goes beyond that. And when I give this argument to some really, strong supporters of the upload, Ray Kurzweil comes to mind, the answer comes back an interesting one, that it doesn't matter. For all practical purposes, that upload is you.
Yeah.
And, I reject that because it's not me.
Right. Yeah.
Everybody might think it's me, and including my wife, as I said, and my psychiatrist, but it isn't.
Right. It's good for them. Maybe not so good for you.
Right.
You. To apply some Bayesian reasoning to this, I'm trying to do this more often now, after I've talked to Sean, I would put the likelihood that we could transfer consciousness into a computer, just in rudimentary terms, I don't know, like 20%. I mean, maybe we could. I'm hopeful. Sean told me to be patient, so I'm being patient.
Yeah.
Hoping maybe technology will catch up with it.
Sean has to, in his worldview, and I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying what he has to do. If he would say that it's not possible, that contradicts his worldview. If you are a materialist, then you must say that it is doable. And there are some people, I'm not going to mention names, who try to take both sides of it, saying that they are physicalists and materialists, but it may not be possible to do. I reject that. I think that's logically incorrect. So Sean is correct in his view. You have to be able to do it. It doesn't matter. It might take, as I said, 20, 100 million years, however long. The point is, in principle, you have to be able to do that. And he has to, and he does affirm it.
Sure. He mentioned, I think, in a podcast with Joe Rogan, that he thinks we could be living in a simulation. It's possible. I think it's possible too. I mean, I don't know how we would ever be able to prove that we are, if we in fact are living in a simulation. So I don't know if it's necessarily material.
Some people say you can prove it by doing experiments at the the 10th or 15th digit out there, and if there begins to be some fuzziness in the data, that you can infer that you're on somebody's computer and they just didn't think it was worth the expense of getting 100 digits of accuracy, and 15 digits was enough. I think that's more fun speculation than based in reality. There are some very thoughtful approaches with multiverse. Paul Davies has an argument against the multiverse, not that he necessarily doesn't believe it, but to challenge the conventional thinking, which he's very good at doing, that says that if you had a multiverse and you had all advanced civilizations, the likelihood that a number of them would create sort of a simple analysis, it would show that therefore the vast number of people or realities are simulated. Therefore, we have to be a simulation. If we're not, that sort of negates a multiverse. And so if you assume that information is the fundamental aspect of reality, which some do, that would tend to support kind of a simulation argument. But I think the reality is that I would put that as a pretty low probability.
Have you oscillated at all from in terms of certainty, not that you're 100% certain on anything, because I would say you're probably not, but just in terms of like, okay, well, maybe I am leaning a little bit more towards thinking that this is more accurate than maybe I gave it credit for at an earlier stage in my life. Are you starting to veer or lean towards any one direction when it comes to some of this stuff?
You know, I would say that I luxuriate in the questions, and don't feel bad that I'm not getting definitive answers. I really have a great comfort in deeply understanding and being able to communicate some of that in each of these big categories. I mean, my instinct, maybe it's more of a hope, and if I have a hope, I always get nervous because hope can cloud reason very quickly.
Yeah.
So I've tried to be very careful about that. That my intuition is that there is substantively more to reality than is currently within our science.
Yeah.
It seems like a pretty tame kind of observation, but
That's a well-framed statement. I think it's a very statement.
And so I would disagree with Sean on that. He would say no, but we might even have an agreement if we start to each define what reality is, because he's a believer in the multi-world theory of quantum physics.
Right. Hugh Everettian,
which is purely physical. I mean, there's nothing beyond the physical. But that type of, from my point of view, that type of reality, a quantum branching, basically, not infinite because it had a start and finite, but number that the number of branches the number has no name, and it increases enormously every flying second, or who knows how long. That could be as bizarre as different from our sense of reality today than people who believe in God. I mean, they each have their own extraordinary aspect to it. We did two television shows in Closer to Truth on the theme of, is the universe theologically ambivalent? One was called, is it theologically ambivalent, and the other was, is it religiously ambivalent? And we dealt with, each one had 5 people, basically all very sophisticated scientists, a few who were believers in God, and maybe the majority who weren't, but some very strong. And my view in those 2 shows was, I really want to know whether God exists. I don't have any illusion that I'm going to figure it out myself, but I like to deal with the question. And where I start is, I have a lot of friends who I've gotten to know, and they're really smart people, and they've done tremendous things in science and in physics, and they're on both sides. I have very smart friends who are pure physicalists, materialists, and then I have very good friends who really believe in God. They're very, very strongly, who are, and make no bones about it. I can just think of Don Page, a physicist who studied with Stephen Hawking, a Canadian, one of the people who know physics and quantum physics. Look that he's one of the top, and he's a very overt believer in Christianity, the Christian God. Francis Collins, head of NIH, one of the best, greatest biological scientists, is very famous for believing in God. Just won the Templeton Prize, just recently announced, because of his believing science is the language of God, which was his book. And so when I integrate that information that I have, I wanted to ask the question. I would come to the conclusion, I put my hypothesis out there, that the universe must be theologically ambiguous. Because if it wasn't ambiguous, it wouldn't have so many smart people on each side. I'm taking myself out of the equation.
Sure.
I'm not giving you my opinion one way or another, because I don't really care what I think. That doesn't hold weight for me, what I think. What does hold weight is the people who I really respect and who really are very smart. And I got them on both sides. And so I come to the conclusion the universe is that's what I put out. And when Sean was on one of these shows, and I asked him, the universe theologically ambivalent, he said no. That was his full answer. And I said, well, Sean, why are so many of our smart friends on the other side of this? He said, I have not the foggiest idea. Or something like that. So, yeah, he's a good spirit. Uh, although I don't know if he'd like me calling him a spirit, but he is a good spirit.
Right. Yeah, for sure. I for the most part have been, most of my adult life an atheist, I would say. Like pretty much like I'm certain this is the way that I think, I've backed off of that quite a bit just in general, because I think being certain about things is not the right way to move forward. But I also think, I've had some experiences that, I at one point I kind of thought I was going crazy a little bit because of some of the things that you think sometimes. But it's, I think the best way I could describe it is that I'm open to the possibility of things that I was not previously open to. And I do think that, generally speaking, that's a good way to be, even if you are pretty sure that something's not right. Saying,
And that's certainly healthy and accurate. And it gives you more tolerance. I mean, obviously, even if God exists, that doesn't mean that all what has been done in God's name in religion is anything other than horrendous in many cases. One has that is a historical fact.
It's interesting. A lot of the, and not to marry these two things because they're not the same, but a lot of people will start to look at some of the Eastern religions, Taoism, Buddhism, and the idea of nothingness, or just like you can eliminate meaning and live through life without meaning and just be purely in the
Mm-hmm.
moment all the time.
Mm-hmm.
That's enlightenment. And I wonder, whether or not there's that's kind of the disconnect sometimes with how people view God as a concept, whether it's an external concept or an internal concept, or whether it's some combination of both, or it's neither. And then, I don't know if there's any other classifications for where people fit God in to the equation, so to speak, but I feel like it's usually one of those things. It's, a lot of people treat it as external. Some people treat it as like totally inside the brain. And I don't know really what to do with that information. I don't know how it falls in line with anything. It seems such a subjective question when somebody asks you, do you believe in God? I would always say, well, like, what are you talking about? Because
Sure.
it means so many different things.
Sure. I think that's valid. In the what I have what we do in Closer Truth is occasionally try to make that distinction, and that to ask the question. We deal with the personal God of the the Abrahamic Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. We deal with the so-called scholastic, or the abstract concept of God, where God is beyond being. You can't say God is being or not being, or exists and doesn't exist, because those categories can't apply.
Right.
And that type of abstract kind of underlying foundations of reality, and these are not necessarily mutually exclusive, and that's a position of maybe Christian orthodoxy to some degree. So that's two things. And then you have, the alternative gods. We had a whole series coming up on YouTube in a month or two on alternative concepts of God. Pantheism is the one that is most known, but where God, the entirety of reality is God, and one is the same, and that's not a physicalism, because it imputes some sort of a spiritual dimension to the nature of reality. And then panentheism, which is a kind of like two Venn diagrams overlap with pantheism. Panentheism is where that's true, that like pantheism, God is, all reality is God, but God is then something else beyond that as well. Pantheism would have there's nothing else beyond it. Panentheism would have God is everything, but then God is something else as well. And then other concepts which are more Eastern religion oriented, whether it's cosmic consciousness or sort of a Buddhist nothingness or emptiness or void, or as a colleague I've been discussing with on the internet, the concept of the no view. It's a kind of an inner sense of devolving, illuminating everything. Again, my argument is if that's true, and I can sense how I could sort of feel that, how then do you explain everything else? Does that generate everything else in some way? Because that inner nothingness, or that in a oneness, and you're merging with everything, however you want to describe it, it's all sort of varieties of the same non-analytical, non-verbal connection of some kind, connection with nothingness, or connection with a oneness, or cosmic consciousness. I think the distinctions between those are thin, and it's all sort of the same idea, which is a very profound idea. But even if that were true, you still have to go to the next step and say, if given that reality, okay, how do you account for everything else? I mean, you have to answer, and I never see that answered. The physicalists, on the other wild extreme from that, would say, in some sense, the laws of physics, whether it's quantum physics or most likely something below that, string theory or something below that, is primitive, is at the most fundamental reality. Why that's the case, would be what they would call an ultimate brute fact. You can't even ask that question. It's just it is what it is. Bertrand Russell, in his famous debate with Copeland on BBC in the 40s, which is breathtakingly brilliant on both sides. It's really worth listening to and reading the transcript. Was asked the question of, wasn't in these terms, but why is there something rather than nothing? And Bertrand Russell, one of the most articulate and smartest guys in the 20th century, basically just said the universe is, and that's all.
Right.
And that's a very unsatisfying answer, but it may be the answer.
How many unsatisfying answers do you get, throughout the course of the last 2 decades? I'm guessing that there have been a lot of frustrating moments, just from because the asking the question is kind of fundamentally frustrating, because you're not going to get.
Yeah, I actually feel the opposite. I mean, I just love to ask questions that, what's frustrating is if I get an answer that's not original, or that I've heard before in so many ways. I mean, I'm always striving to get new ways of addressing the fundamental questions. I don't have an illusion that I'm going to really make progress in understanding an answer, but I like to find new ways of possible answers, even if I'm sure they're wrong. So I don't know, maybe that's my odd personality, but I really like to search for new ways of thinking about topics. And one of our, two of our themes that are two of my favorites and have been working well with our audiences is, why is there anything at all? Why something rather than nothing? And what exists? And what exists is why something rather than nothing is obvious. Why is anything at all, including abstract objects or God or logic or who knows what? Why is there anything at all? And the what exists says, what are the most fundamental categories of reality? And what, so David Chalmers would say, maybe the laws of physics and proto-consciousness. And maybe Sean Carroll would say, some ultimate laws of physics. And maybe Some spiritualists would say, pure consciousness and everything is derived from that. Um, but everybody has different opinions, and then how you get the smallest number of categories, of which will exhaust reality. And in each of these ways of thinking, we have multiple shows, and because I'm asking the same questions and I'm pushing the same way, but we have different people and different expressions, and carefully pick the people to where they all make a unique contribution. And I am never tired, even though the answer is the same. It is a constant source of both excitement and elation to be able to deal with that topic and to hear really smart people give me answers, some of which I've thought about this a lot. I did a book with John Leslie, who's one of the original, sort of one of my intellectual mentors in terms of thinking about these kinds of things. And so I'm pretty well versed in all this stuff, but that's why I love to keep asking it. And fairly frequently, I hear ways of expression or thoughts on this that I hadn't thought of before. And that to me is a great joy.
I was going to ask you about music because I have heard music brought up, especially by people who are believers, people who do believe in some grand thing, as though as music and the ability to appreciate music is unexplainable through strictly physical terms. And what do you think about music? What have you learned about music over the course of over your life?
Sure. Well, first of all, in my life, music has been extremely important for me. I met my wife because I was doing my PhD. She had just gotten her master's in piano, and we lived in the same apartment. And I was playing Mahler's Second on my hi-fi, and she was practicing Chopin's First Ballade. And so that's how we met, and that's how we have 3 children and grandchildren. So it certainly affected our lives in that way. But I've loved music. And up until recently, we really didn't deal with it on Closer to Truth. It was not a focal point. We maybe did one very early show on music. But recently, in the last 2 years, it's been a major focus of Closer to Truth. Right now, in our PBS cycles, we are broadcasting Closer to Truth's 20th season, which is 10 episodes. It's a dedicated season called Art Seeking Understanding. And it is dealing with all aspects of art, from painting, music, dance, literature, but primary things are visual arts and musical arts. And we deal with it from a neuroscience point of view, cognitive psychology, history, religion, and theology. So all of these different categories are brought together, and this is a theme that we're going to be continuing. So right now, it's in PBS broadcast and on PBS stations around the country. Here in Southern California, it's on 3 times a week on PBS SoCal, PBS SoCal World, and PBS SoCal 2. And it's 10 episodes. We deal with philosophy of music. We deal with philosophy of art. Can art discern the existence of God? Can art discern, if there is a God, can you discern God's nature by the nature of art? I mean, we really deal with some very sophisticated approaches to it. And this will be put on YouTube probably beginning of next year. We're going through several broadcast cycles on PBS before it'll go on YouTube. And then we are very likely, we're planning right now to do a second season of that, which would come out in 2 years or something like that. So it's a major area for exploration, and it is a sort of an extension of what we're doing on Closer to Truth, which is very exciting.
Okay, so could you give me a taste a little bit? I'm excited. I want to watch the episodes now. I'm curious about what if.
Well, we do have on YouTube. If you go to the Closer to Truth YouTube homepage and you go down somewhat, we have individual interviews from some of the participants in the Art Seeking Understanding series. It's not the beautiful episodes, as I said, those are being broadcast, but we have some individual interviews, which is most of what Closer to Truth does. Is we've done 257 episodes in the current season. We had an original 43, which were roundtable. So we're right close to right at 300 altogether. But in terms of individual interviews, we have about 4,000. So but those are just straight on interviews like we're doing now, without integrating and without the thought tracks. And so, art and what art may mean is a very probative aspect to both the nature of consciousness and the possibility of reflecting a larger meaning. It certainly relates to consciousness, no doubt about that, in terms of understanding human mentality and perhaps consciousness. And it may have some, people would argue, I would be open-minded, that it has some way of connecting with a larger meaning.
I've heard you say this a lot on Closer to Truth, that you have a
No, the Closer to Truth.
Closer to Truth. Sorry.
Yeah, no, the. This is a really big deal for me. I mean,
Truth. Closer to the truth. Right.
No, the Closer to Truth. That's when we first started, I had an argument with the PBS station that they wanted Closer to the truth, because they said people will want to know that this is the truth. And I said, well, then they shouldn't ask me.
Closer to Truth.
Right.
But you mentioned that you have a difficult relation. You've had a hard time with faith. And I'm the same way. I have a very difficult time with the concept of it. I feel like in some ways, faith is a coping mechanism for unknowable things, and it's just a way for us to be able to reconcile our own existences with things that we just we don't have access to. We don't have access to that information. So we got to have some sort of mechanism to reconcile it so that we can move forward, even though we're moving forward inevitably. But I kind of, that's kind of where I am with faith. Although I will say I understand, certainly, especially for people who go through transformative experiences, that they gain a new appreciation for their own life. Though they always seem to have some reliance on faith as a mechanism for that appreciation, and I can respect that. I have a very difficult time allowing myself the ease to move that far, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have said I admire people who have faith. I've said, people talk about the gift of faith. Well, I wasn't deemed one to have been given such a gift. Faith, by definition, means you can't subject it. You don't have evidence. You can't subject it to rational thinking, or it wouldn't be faith. So it's the belief without the evidence or without the argument. So that, and so when I deal with people who refer to that, or when we deal with that, I like to understand the steps that are made, and when there's a leap that you're going over, then we're very clear to see where that leap is being made and why it's being made, what the rationale is, how you feel, and why you've done it, and what happened, and all of that. I've said that that if I had an experience, or I had feeling or whatever, I wouldn't trust it. Why would I trust it? I'm the easiest one to fool, especially because I would like to believe.
Yeah.
So I'm a ripe candidate to be self-deluded or deluded by someone else or something. So I remember one of our philosophers, Pete Rundle, made an interesting point. He's an atheist. He sadly died a few years ago. But he made the point that, let's say I'm going to a shrine and I see people without limbs being instantly regrown, and they're believing in God and God's doing it. And I'm seeing multiple people regrowing limbs. He said the likelihood of God doing that is less than an alien spaceship circling the backside of the moon that has an advanced technology that it's testing. Something, I'm exaggerating a little bit. So, we tend to use information to kind of justify our own belief systems. Near-death experiences, people always see it within the context of their own religion or their own cultural experiences. And so, I'm not saying there's nothing to any of these things. But what I am saying is that that if I would have that, which I haven't, but if I would, I wouldn't trust it. And I've also said, I hope not meant sarcastically or brazenly, that if there were a God and because many people say, what would it take for you to believe? I mean, you'd think that's a question that I would get a lot. What would it take? You're hard-headed and asking these hard questions. What would it take for you to believe? And I said, if I had an experience, that would not be it, because I wouldn't believe it. Right. So they said, well, what would do it? And I said, well, if there is a God, it's not my job to determine what that God should do to make me believe it. That's God's job. So if God's God and God wants me to believe, God would figure out a way how to do that, because I can't.
Right. I think that's a good answer to that question. Okay. I know we've taken up a lot of your time.
Right.
I just wanted to end on a final question about death and time, which is a good way to end death and time.
Sure.
That's another one of these really things I have a hard time dealing with is my own subjective conscious experience is going to end at some point. I don't remember what happened before I was born. I know I'm not going to remember, obviously, what happens after I die. So I know that this is a finite window with which I get to experience things. And I don't have any idea what's going to happen on either end. But there's very strong inference called, everything, that things were here way before I was, and things are going to be here way after I am gone. And that gives me a lot of anxiety sometimes, or at least it has at points in my life. And I'm curious, what, if at all, you have come to, or a place you've come to when it comes to reconciling the fact that time, allows us to observe these things, allows us to be, or I say allow, just for lack of a better word, but that you can square that. You're comfortable with where you're at, where you're going, what you've done, all the way in which the system has aligned itself, and that, things are the way that they are. Are you comfortable with all of that? I guess maybe comfortable is not the right word, but
No, I'm not comfortable. No.
That's the hardest thing to me. It's like, okay, all right, I get it. Finite, infinite. All right, okay.
The famous Woody Allen line that he said, are you really pleased that you can live on through your legacy? He said, no, I want to live on in my apartment. So.
Yeah, I want to live a long time. I think all people want to live a long time.
In terms of length, though, I guess I've dealt with, big numbers in time and universe, that living a long time doesn't mean anything to me, because it's all effectively zero compared to infinity. Right. So, if you can live a million years, in a sense, there's no difference than living 100 years or 50 years. I mean, it sounds very philosophical, and obviously we want to live and we want our families to live, and we're all normal in that respect. But in a philosophical sense, it really doesn't matter. What matters is there a possibility that there's something beyond what we now experience? And my perspective, there's a non-zero probability that the nature of consciousness suggests there's something beyond the physical. And that's as far as I can go, and I don't think I can ever go further than that, but I do go there.
Yeah. I think I'm with you. I I don't, I'm not in a hurry to get there,
Okay.
obviously, but I'm pretty curious what happens when the lights go out,
Yeah.
So, like the idea, I just a little, and I promise we're almost done. I was raised as a Jehovah's Witness. So, my family taught me to believe that I was going to live forever. Like that was the goal, is to
Yeah.
live forever. And the older I get, the more and more I think that not only is that not the goal, but it's not necessarily reasonable to think that that should be the goal. That things.
I might disagree with that.
Oh,
I would. There's a lot of people have said that if I don't want to live forever because that would be, more hell than heaven. I do not agree with that. I do not agree with that. I mean,
like the aspiration of eternal life.
I don't like the aspiration of it. I would like the reality of it. But I'm well down on the scale of will that happen? But but I'm still but I'm above zero.
Okay. All right. This has been fantastic. I've absolutely loved this. I have a lot more questions for you, but I think you have a life to live, and I do too. So
Good. Okay, enjoyed it.
thank you very much.
Keep well.
Take care.
Bye bye.